The 6th of December. A camel can move from place to place as well, a bit like the castles on a chessboard. When Joachim woke up on Sunday morning, it felt as if he had just fallen asleep, for he hadn't woken once during the whole of that long night. Then he realized that he had dreamed, and as soon as he remembered the dream, it seemed to him that the night had been quite a long one after all. He had dreamed that the magic advent calendar was filled with small chocolate figures that turned into real animals as soon as he opened the doors and let them out of prison. To stop them running away, he had to lock them up in his secret box, and he had only let them out on Christmas Eve. Then all 24 chocolate animals crept out through the window and set off through the countryside. They were going to Bethlehem, because that's where the Christ child was born. Joachim knew that Jesus had loved everyone, but in his dream he had been fond of chocolate too. Joachim sat up and laughed. He was ready to open the sixth door in the Advent calendar. Today there was a picture of a round tower. He would look more closely at the picture afterwards. First he had to read what was on the scrap of paper. Casper. When the boat with Elizabeth, the angel Ephuriel, Joshua the shepherd, and the three sheep touched the land on the Danish side of the Thre Sound, they were welcomed politely by a black man. It was Elizabeth who discovered him first. The angel who was rowing sat with his back to the shore, and Joshua was busy keeping the sheep quiet. "There's a man over there," she remarked. The angel glanced over his shoulder and said, "Then he's one of us." The black man had a dark cloak with gold buttons and woolen trousers and sheepskin shoes. He came towards them, seized the boat, and pulled them up on land. The sheep jumped out first, and soon they were all standing on the beach. The man with the fine clothes bent down and took Elizabeth's hand. "Greetings to you, my child, and welcome. I'm King Caspar of Nubia," Elizabeth, courtesying politely. She wasn't quite sure how to behave. Perhaps she should have said that her name was Elizabeth Hansen and that she came from Norway, but that wouldn't have been very interesting just after he had told her that he was the king of Nubia. "He's one of the three wise men from the east," whispered Ephriel solemnly. "Or one of the three kings of the Orient," nodded Joshua. None of this made the situation any easier for Elizabeth. If she was going to say anything, it would have to be that she was the princess of Toten or something like that. Then maybe the king would have believed that Toten was a mighty kingdom. The Black King bowed again and said, "The pleasure is on my side of Thor Sound. You should know that I've been standing here waiting for you for so long that between 1701 and 1699 I had to play hopscotch." This sounded so mysterious that Elizabeth began rubbing her eyes to find out whether she was properly awake. It was difficult enough to play hopscotch between squares on the asphalt, but how could the wise man manage to play hopscotch between two different years? He explained in more detail. "When I arrived on this shore in the year of our Lord, 1701, some fishermen appeared, and they were so dismayed when they saw one of the three wise men that I had to take a step backwards. That's how I got to the year 1700. I sat down and looked out over Throw Sound, but after a while a couple of soldiers on horseback came from the fortress in Copenhagen. They too were somewhat dismayed to see a black king. You see, at the moment I'm the only black man in the whole of Denmark, at least, the only one who is a king of the Orient besides. That sort of thing attracts attention, my friends, for people find it difficult to get used to something completely different. So I hurried back to the year 1699, and since then I have waited here. From that time From that time on, I have met neither man nor beast, and I have had no need to hide myself from sun and moon, nor from the stars of heaven either. For the stars are so close to God that they would never permit themselves to gossip about the life of humans on earth. Elizabeth wasn't sure that she understood all this, but she did see that she was talking to a real wise man, and he was so wise that she didn't quite know where to look. It was a great relief to her when at last the shepherd thumped his crook on the ground. To Bethlehem, to Bethlehem. The little procession of pilgrims began to move off again. The three sheep first, Joshua and Caspar, the Black King next, Elizabeth and Ephraim last. They leapt along broad cobbled streets, and Ephraim explained that this was Copenhagen, the king's city. It was so early in the morning that the streets were almost deserted. Elizabeth thought it was a blessing to see a big city empty of cars. Instead, you had to put up with the horse droppings that were fertilizing the streets. The time is 1648, announced the angel Furiel. It's the last year of Christian IV's reign. He became king of Denmark and Norway when he was still a small child many years ago. Norway is part of Denmark at this time. Christian IV is very fond of Norway and has visited the country often. Soon they arrived at the very center of the Danish capital. They stopped in front of a church with a round tower at one end. That's the round tower which King Christian had just built on to the new Trinity Church, said Furiel. The church towers look imposing, but he thought it was a pity that they should stand there to no purpose. So the round tower has been built both as a church tower as a watchtower where astronomers can stand in peace and quiet studying the movements of the planets and the positions of the stars in the sky. These are the days when the first telescopes are being invented. That's a strange mixture, said Elizabeth. She felt that she had to say something clever every now and again, but the wise man shook his head. The stars are created by God too, he said. So studying the stars in the sky can be like a whole church service, but here they have neither deserts nor camels. Elizabeth stared at him, puzzled, and the wise man continued. The best way to study the stars, in the opinion of all wise men, is to sit on the back of a camel in the desert. It's almost like sitting in a tower, but a camel can move from place to place as well, a bit like the castles on a chessboard. The only thing that's inconvenient for a camel is to go through the eye of a needle. Elizabeth was not all sure whether she agreed that the back of a camel could be compared with a church tower or a desert with a chessboard. The drawback of a watchtower, Caspar went on, is that it usually stands stock still. I've seen a tower that has stood in the same spot for more than 1,000 years. The old walls must get bored with the view. On the other hand, they have experienced how people have come and gone, and perhaps that has given them insight. Elizabeth nodded. Caspar had even more to tell her. There are two ways of becoming wise. One way is to travel out into the world and to see as much as possible of God's creation. The other is to put down roots in one spot and to study everything that happens there in as much detail as you can. The trouble is that it's impossible to do both at the same time. Elizabeth was struck with wonder at the wise man's words. To be on the safe side, she clapped her hands, and the angel and the shepherd did the same. Caspar was infected by their enthusiasm and began clapping too, because he was so pleased with all that had been said. Elizabeth thought it must be fun to keep thinking such clever thoughts. It was as if the wise man had read her thoughts. He said, "Thinking clever thoughts is almost like being at a circus. Not a circus with clowns or elephants, but a real thinking circus. But let it be said once and for all. I'm grateful to all clowns and elephants for their attention." Joshua thumped his crook on the cobbles. "To Bethlehem," he said, "to Bethlehem." The procession of pilgrims began to move along the streets again. Through the city and out to the country they went, between swaying fields of corn and coal, leafy woodland. Denmark seemed to be extra flat. She could see no tall buildings. The only things that pointed upwards occasionally were the churches they passed, all of them built in honor of a little child who once upon a time was born in Bethlehem. They caught sight of the sea in the distance and came down to a small town called Korsor, which lay beside the Great Belt, the broad sound between Sealand and Fyn. The people in the town almost fell over when they caught a glimpse of the astonishing procession, but their terror lasted only a short time, for the next moment the procession had moved 1 or 2 weeks backwards in the history of the town. Then there were other people who caught a glimpse of the pilgrimage for a second or two. At that time there was continual talk of angels. Joshua pointed to a large rowing boat at the water's edge. "We shall have to borrow that," he said. "Hurry up now, it's nearly 1600, years after Jesus' birth," and he fell to chasing his sheep on board. Elizabeth felt she had to ask whether this wasn't stealing, but Ephraim reminded her that Jesus had to borrow an ass when he rode into Jerusalem. A little later, they were out on the Great Belt. The angel rowed with one oar, the black king Caspar with the other. He had to work hard in order to row as strongly as Ephraim. When Mama came in to look at the advent calendar, Joachim forgot that he mustn't talk about what he had read on the folded piece of paper. She leaned over the picture. "That must be the Tower of Babylon." Joachim shook his head. "Oh no, that's the Round Tower in Copenhagen." Mama looked at him in astonishment. "Who told you that?" "No idea," replied Joachim. That was how Mama answered him when he asked her something she couldn't tell him. "It's impossible to play chess with a tower like that, because it stands stock still. And if you sit inside it, you soon get bored with the view. But on the other hand, you may get some insight." Mama clasped her hands together. Joachim thought it was because he had something clever, but all she said was, "But Joachim, where do you get all this from?" The 7th of December. In heaven, we've always considered this to be a slight exaggeration. All that afternoon, Joachim kept on thinking about Caspar, the Black King who had been waiting in Denmark for Elizabeth, the angel Ephraim, and Joshua the shepherd. How did he know they were coming? Did Ephraim and the king of Nubia have an agreement to meet precisely there in the year 1699? There was nothing to show that their meeting was accidental after all. "Then he's one of us," the angel had said as soon as he saw Caspar. All of a sudden Joachim thought of the bookseller. He had said that the advent calendar looked homemade, and Joachim agreed. It looked as if it had been cut out and glued at home in the kitchen. If John had made the magic advent calendar, he would have been certain to call the girl in the story after Elizabeth in the picture. But why had he done it? Why had he made the calendar in order to leave it in a bookshop without knowing what would become of it afterwards? In the evening, when Joachim was going to bed, he tried to push all the open doors shut again, so that he could look at the large picture properly. Then it happened again, and this time with one of the 3 wise men who were kneeling behind the baby Jesus in the manger. His skin was dark, just like Caspar the Black King, and Joachim hadn't noticed it before. Why hadn't he discovered that? Again he had the feeling that the picture became clearer and clearer with every day that passed. Before he put out the light, he glanced at it one more time, and thought it must be strange to be in Bethlehem exactly at the time when Jesus was born. Elizabeth was on her way there, and in a way he was going along on the journey himself. When he woke up the next morning, he opened the 7th door and saw a picture of a sheep eating grass in front of some high walls. He picked up a scrap of paper that was folded over and read what was written on it. The fourth ship. The angel Ethereal and the Black King Caspar had rowed Elizabeth, Joshua, and the three sheep over the great bell. "We're going ashore again," said Ethereal. "This island is called Fen, and it's exactly 1599 years since Jesus was born in Bethlehem." From the sea they ran towards a large castle on a mound between ramparts and ditches. "That's Nyborg Castle," the angel told them. "We're standing in front of the oldest royal fortress in Scandinavia." Elizabeth pointed up at one of the ramparts. "There's a shepherd. There's a sheep," the angel nodded. "Then it's one of us." With that they all leapt up on to the ramparts. The three sheep first, Joshua and Caspar after them, Elizabeth and Ethereal last. A soldier rushed out from between the buildings in the castle. He raised a spear and shouted, "Sheep thieves!" Next moment 3 of 4 soldiers came storming up. All of them had spears, and one of them had a kind of gun as well. The angel Ethereal confronted the soldiers, and they threw themselves down on the ground and hid their heads in their hands. "Fear not," said the angel in a gentle voice. "I bring you tidings of great joy. This ship will come with us to the Holy Land where the Christ child is to be born." Only one of the soldiers dared to look up. He was the one who had called them sheep thieves. "Be merciful unto us and take the sheep with you," he cried. The sheep in question had already joined the others as if it belonged to the little flock. Joshua struck his crook against the rampart and said, "To Bethlehem, to Bethlehem." Off they went across the green island, the 4 sheep first, Joshua, Caspar, Furiel, and Elizabeth following them. On the bank of a small river they passed a town with narrow streets and one-story dwellings. On the outskirts stood an ancient stone church with a square tower. "That's Odense Cathedral," said Furiel. "It's called after Canute the Holy, who was killed here in the year 1086. "What's the time by the angel watch?" asked Elizabeth. "It's 1537 years after Christ. From now on, the Bible will be printed in all the languages of the world, so that everyone can read about Jesus. For in these days, the art of printing will be invented. Before, these books have had to be written by hand, and only the priests were able to read the Bible, but not many people have learned to read. Now it will be decided that everyone must go to school." "Some years ago," said Caspar, "a Polish astronomer called Copernicus discovered that the earth is as round as a ball and moves in orbit around the sun. This wasn't news to wise men, but to most people it was new and exciting. Sailors could now travel around the world, and that's how Columbus reached America in the year 1492. After him, the Spanish sailors cruelly attacked the Indians. In the opinion of the kings of the Orient, it would have been better if they had kept to the ships of the desert, for there is no more peaceful animal than a camel in the desert, and peace is the message of Christmas." Elizabeth was still trying to understand what the wise man had said when Joshua struck the ground with his crook. "To Bethlehem, to Bethlehem." They went on their way along a ridge that gave them a good view over Fen. Now and then they looked down on a horse drawing a plough or an ox harnessed to a cart. "It's not so flat here," said Elizabeth as she ran, "but we're still in Denmark, aren't we?" The angel nodded. "Yes, indeed. And the Danes are very proud of ridges like this. But we're only 100 meters above sea level. They have called the hillsides we can see down there on the left the Finn Alps. Another ridge is called the Heavenly Mountain. In heaven, we've always considered this to be a slight exaggeration." The procession had paused, and Caspar joined in the conversation again. But it's important to be happy about the little you have, however little it is. It's infinitely more than nothing. If the world was round and smooth as a ball, said Elizabeth thoughtfully, there wouldn't be one single mountain on the whole earth. But then, even a rocky slope would be as exciting as the highest mountain in Norway, as long as it was the only rocky slope. So, you see how easily clever ideas travel, said the wise man. You've been with a wise man for only a fairly short time, but you've already understood a tiny part of the heavenly wisdom. Bravo! Elizabeth was glad she had said something clever for once. She felt so cheered by it that she tried again. And if the world was if the world was as small as the moon, nobody would have complained that it hadn't been made a bit larger. How true that is, said Caspar. Even if the world had been no larger than a pea, it would have been as big a mystery. For where would the little pea have come from? That too would have had to be created by God. It's no easier to create a pea than to create a whole solar system. Elizabeth thought this was a bit of an exaggeration, for if the world hadn't been any larger than a pea, it wouldn't have had room for even Adam and Eve. If there had been only one star in the sky, Caspar continued, that one star would have aroused as much wonder as all the other stars together. After all, nobody goes around complaining because there's only one moon. On the contrary, if there had been 100 moons, they would only have got in each other's way. So the creation of billions of stars in the sky was an excessive exaggeration. Whenever there's too much of anything, you can stare at it without appreciating it. That's how it's possible to be out under a starry sky and fail to see a single star because of a shower of shooting stars. It was quite true, thought Elizabeth. She had often looked at a sky full of stars without finding any particular one. Caspar went on. In the opinion of the kings of the Orient, God spoiled the humans a bit, because he created far too much at the same time. He created so many strange things to look at that many people don't see God, but that's how he managed to hide himself too. He wouldn't have been able to do that if only 4 people, 3 trees, 2 sheep, and 8 camels existed in the whole of creation. If only one fish could be found in the sea, people would probably have noticed how perfect it was. And then they might have started asking who had made it. For a while he remained standing, looking about him. Elizabeth thought he was waiting for someone to applaud his wise words, so she clapped her hands together. Then the others began clapping as well. There, said Caspar. That wasn't so much to clap for. Then he seemed to change his mind, although it was infinitely more than nothing. The procession of pilgrims ran down towards a little town beside a narrow strip of water. The sound is called the Little Belt, said Furiel. The time is 1504, years after Christ. The time is 1580 years after Christ. Before Elizabeth was able to ask how they were going to cross the sound, Joshua was on his way towards a boat that lay moored to a little quay. In the boat sat a young man drawing up a fishing line. When he caught sight of the angel Furiel, he dropped the line into the sea and threw himself down with his head on the deck. Be not afraid, said Furiel. We are pilgrims on our way to the Holy Land, where Jesus is to be born. Can you roll us over the little belt? Amen, replied the ferryman. Amen, amen. The angel knew his answer meant yes. The 4 sheep and the rest of the pilgrims climbed on board the boat. While the ferryman rowed across the sound, he stared and stared at the Furiel. It was probably the first time he had seen a proper angel. He didn't even glance at the black king Caspar. If the angel had not been with them, Elizabeth thought, the ferryman would most certainly have had more than enough to do staring at the Black King. Only if the king had not been with them either, would he perhaps have looked at her? She thought it was a shame that the world should be like that. When they were over on the other side and the ship began jumping out of the boat, they said thank you and goodbye to the ferryman. As for the ferryman, he only repeated what he had already said over and over again. Amen, amen. Joachim had just finished reading what was on the paper when his mother came into the room. He screwed up the paper quickly, but Mamma saw that he was hiding something. What are you holding in your hand? Nothing, he said, only air. May I say it then? But Joachim held the ball of paper so hard that his knuckles were quite white. It's a Christmas present, he said. The words Christmas present might have been magic. At any rate, they made Mamma smile broadly. For me? Joachim nodded. Then I won't look, said Mamma. But it must be a very tiny Christmas present. It's infinitely bigger than nothing, said Joachim. So Mamma went to the bathroom. Joachim thought it was strange that everything that had to do with the Christmas was so special. It was one of the most secret things in the whole world. But Mamma was mistaken about one thing. What he was holding in his hand wasn't a tiny Christmas present. 8th of December. Part of the glory of heaven that had strayed down to earth. On the 8th of December, Joachim was woken by Mamma. She ruffled his hair and said, Time to get up, Joachim. It's 10:30, and you start school early today. He drew himself up in bed. The first thing he thought of was the magic advent calendar hanging above his head. Mamma seemed to read his thoughts, but you have time to open the advent calendar. Joachim thought quickly. He thought so quickly that there was room for an awful lot of thoughts before Mamma went on. Aren't you going to open it then? I'd like to see it too. No, thought Joachim. He couldn't open the magic advent calendar while Mamma was watching. I don't think you're properly awake yet, Mamma went on. Perhaps you'll let me open the advent calendar today? No, said Joachim, so loudly and clearly that Mamma jumped. I'll wait till I come home from school. I'll have more time then. He jumped out of bed quickly to be quite certain Mamma wasn't going to start opening the calendar. Of course you do just as you like, she said. She went out to the kitchen while Joachim got dressed. When Joachim came home from school, a man he did not recognize was standing outside the garden gate. Since he didn't know the man, Joachim pretended he hadn't seen him. He opened the gate and closed it after him. Is your name Joachim? Asked the stranger. Joachim stopped on the path that Papa had almost cleared of snow and turned towards the man. He was quite old. He looked kind, too. Joachim didn't like someone he didn't know to know his name, but he had to answer. Yes, he said, that's me. The man nodded. He came right up to the gate and leaned over it. He was wearing a green felt hat. I thought so. He had rather an odd accent. Perhaps he wasn't Norwegian. You've been given a fine advent calendar, haven't you? Joachim gave a start. How did you know that? How did he know that? A magic advent calendar, answered Joachim. A magic advent calendar? Yes, price 75 or. My name's John. I sell flowers at the market. Joachim stood stock still without saying anything. In his advent calendar he had read about people who had suddenly seen an angel. Now it was almost as if he was being visited by an angel himself. He knew his meeting with the flower seller was important, and he wanted to say something serious, but he only managed it. How did you know where I lived? John chuckled to himself. Good question, my boy, he said. I often go into the bookshop, you see. I like it there. I wanted to hear where the old calendar had ended up. It was a good thing your father forgot his driving license. If he hadn't, it would have been much more difficult for me to find you. But I expect you to have come down to me on the market sooner or later. Don't you think so?" Joachim nodded. He had thought of it. "Did you know there were some pieces of paper in the Advent calendar?" he asked. "If there's anyone in the whole world who knows, it must be me. Now you know too," said John. "Is it homemade?" "Completely homemade, yes, and very old. But that's an old story. Have you opened the calendar today?" Joachim shook his head. "I have to do it when Mama and Papa aren't looking, because I don't want them to know about the pieces of paper. I'm going to pack them up on Christmas Eve and put them under the Christmas tree." "That's a good idea," said John. "But what about yesterday then? Didn't the Pilgrims take a ship with them from the old castle on Finn, and the angel Ethereal had to say, 'Be not afraid,' to the sentries at the castle?" Joachim was almost scared because John knew all about it. "Did you make the magic calendar? The magic advent calendar?" he asked. Yes and no. Joachim was afraid he might go. So he quickly asked another question. "Did it all really happen, or did you make it up?" John looked serious. "It's all right to ask, but it isn't always so easy to answer." Joachim said, "I wondered whether Elizabeth in the Magic Advent calendar was the same as the Elizabeth whose picture was in the bookshop." "So he told you about the old picture too," said John, sighing heavily. Well, well, I have nothing to hide anymore. I'm too old for that now. But it isn't Christmas yet, so we'd better talk about Elizabeth another time." He took a step back. Sabbathebus, he mumbled to himself. Joachim didn't understand that, but perhaps he hadn't been meant to hear it. Finally, John said, "I must go now, but we'll meet again, for that old story links us human beings together." He walked away rapidly and soon disappeared. Joachim was annoyed that he hadn't had time to ask more questions. He ought to have asked whether the big calendar picture was gradually changing as he read the pieces of paper. He hurried into the house and opened the door with the number 8 on it. Today there was a picture of a shepherd carrying a lamb on his shoulders. Joachim picked up the paper, smoothed it out carefully, and read, "Jacob. On one of the last days of the year 1499, after Christ's worship, one shepherd, one king of the Orient, one angel, and a little girl from Norway flocked out of a boat that had brought them across the little belt to Jutland." "Thank goodness," exclaimed Caspar, as they stepped on land. "Yes, it will be a long time now before we have to do that again," replied Joshua. The angel Ethereal nodded. "Verily I say unto you that there will be only one more time before we get to Bethlehem." Elizabeth had no idea what they were talking about. "Isn't it still terribly far to Bethlehem?" she asked. "Yes, indeed," said the angel. "It is far, and many hundreds of years too. But there is only one more stretch of ocean to cross. That won't happen until we get to the Black Sea." The little procession came to a town at the inner end of a fjord, and one end of the town stood a large fortress. "This town is called Kolding and is in South Jutland," said the angel Ethereal. "It has been an important trading place for hundreds of years. The fortress is called Koldingos, and the kings of Denmark have often lived here. The time is 1488 years after Christ's birth." Joshua struck the ground with his crook. "To Bethlehem, to Bethlehem." They came to the top of a little ridge with fine views over the countryside. Fresh flowers were growing everywhere, so it must have been early summer. Elizabeth pointed out at the ground as she ran. "Look at all the lovely wild flowers," she said. The angel nodded mysteriously. "They are part of the glory of heaven that has strayed down to earth," he explained. "You see, There's so much glory in heaven that it can easily spill over. Elizabeth pondered over the angel's words and hid them in her heart. Suddenly the shepherd stopped and pointed at the little flock of sheep. A lamb is missing. He needed to say no more, for all of them saw that the earth seemed to have swallowed up the lamb with the bell. "Where is it?" exclaimed Elizabeth. "The lambs are so charming with their white fleece that they're a delight to the eye, but they're most uncontrollable," said Joshua. "It doesn't always help to put a bell on them either. If I'm watching one lamb, the other will suddenly vanish, and when I find the second lamb, all of a sudden the first lamb will decide to leave the flock. Shepherding is a difficult job, and it's especially difficult to herd a flock of sheep all the way to Bethlehem. As it is written, 'Now I must leave the other sheep to look for the one lamb that is missing.'" Elizabeth felt her eyes fill with tears, but just then a man appeared over the crest of the ridge. He was wearing clothes exactly like Joshua's, and on his shoulders he was carrying the lamb with the bell. "He's one of us," said Ephraim. The man put the lamb down at Elizabeth's feet. He held out his hand to Joshua and said, "I am Jacob, the shepherd, and the second of the shepherds in the field. Now I can help care for the flock that's going to Bethlehem." Elizabeth clapped her hands. Joshua struck the ground with his crook and said, "To Bethlehem, to Bethlehem." The two shepherds ran behind the little flock, with Caspar, the black king, the angel Uriel, and Elizabeth behind them. As they were passing the old market town of Flensburg, the angel Uriel said, "The time is 1402 years after the birth of Christ. We shall soon be crossing the frontier into Germany and diving down into the depths of the Middle Ages." Joachim stood lost in thought. The angel Ephraim had said that the wild flowers were a part of the glory of heaven that had strayed down to earth. Because there's so much glory in heaven that it can easily spill over. Probably only a flower seller could write something like that. He didn't tell Mama and Papa that John had visited him. If he told them about that, he would have to give away the secret of the scraps of paper too. Joachim now had so many secrets to keep that he felt his head could split at any moment. The 9th of December. They had broken a solemn promise. Joachim couldn't stop thinking about the words John had muttered to himself. Sabbath Tebas. Who or what were Sabbath and Tebas? Could those strange words have anything to do with the magic Advent calendar? Before he went to bed, he wrote the words down in a little notebook, so as not to forget them by the morning. Then he discovered something odd. Sabbath became Tebas when he read it backwards, so of course Tebas turned into Sabbath too. This was so mysterious that he wrote down the two words like this. Perhaps one day the magic words would help him to understand more about the old Advent calendar. Suddenly he remembered something the bookseller had said. Hadn't he said that the old flower seller was a bit odd? Joachim didn't think he seemed the least bit odd. Of course it was unusual to pour water over people's heads, but it was just the sort of thing that Joachim might suddenly decide to do himself. As soon as Joachim woke up on the 9th of December, he sat up in bed and hurried to open the Advent calendar. It was a picture of a man playing a pipe. After the man came a long procession of children, big and small. Joachim looked at it for a long time before he picked up the piece of paper that had fallen out of the calendar. He made himself comfortable and read what was on the paper. The fifth ship. It was the year 1378 after Christ. 3 godly sheep and a lamb with a bell stormed into the Hanseatic city of Hamburg. Behind the little flock ran 2 shepherds. An elegantly dressed black king followed the shepherds. Behind the black man, a little girl was running as fast as her short legs would carry her. After the girl, an angel hovered above the ground. It was Sunday, and early in the morning. A few people were about in the streets on their way to morning mass in the old Jacob's church. As soon as they caught sight of the procession of pilgrims, they gestured with their arms. Some of them shaded their eyes, and one of them exclaimed, "God be praised." Something similar had happened in the town of Hanover a few years earlier. It was 1351, immediately after the fearful plague that had cost so many human lives, not only in Germany, but in the whole of Europe. It was a Monday, and the market stalls on the great market square were about to open. Peasants in their worn, homespun clothes and market women in rough skirts and began setting out their wares. All of them had lost some of their dear ones. It was just before the dawn of a new day. It was then that a little flock of sheep suddenly sprang into the market. One of the sheep overturned a table of vegetables. After the sheep there came a strange company. There were a couple of shepherds and a man in exotic clothes, black-skinned like an African. The black man was followed by a white-clad figure with wings on its back. Right at the end there appeared a little girl. She stumbled over the shaft of a cart full of cabbages and lay there after the rest of the godly company had left the market. Elizabeth wept bitterly when she saw the angel Ephuriel and all the others disappearing. It was the second time on the long journey south that she had fallen and hurt herself. Now she had lost the procession of pilgrims and was surrounded by people she didn't know. Not only was she in a foreign country, she was in a foreign century too. The people in the market were terrified by what they had seen. They crowded around Elizabeth, and a man poked her with his foot as if he was afraid to touch her. He wrinkled his nose and grunted horribly, but soon an old woman put Elizabeth on her feet and tried to comfort her. She spoke a language Elizabeth didn't understand. "I'm going to Bethlehem," said Elizabeth, and the market woman replied, "Hamelin, Hamelin?" "No, no," so sobbed Elizabeth. "To Bethlehem, to Bethlehem." Those were her words. The next moment one of the angels of the Lord appeared in an arc of light above the market. Elizabeth stretched out her arms towards the angel and cried, "Ephuriel, Ephuriel!" The people in the market threw themselves to the ground, but the angel lifted Elizabeth up into the air, flew over the spire of the new market church, and was gone. He put her down on a country road outside the town where the sheep, the shepherds, and Caspar, the black king, were waiting. "Isn't that just what I was saying?" chuckled Joshua. "When one of the lambs is lost, the shepherd must leave his flock and find the lamb that has wandered away." He struck the ground with his crook. "To Bethlehem, to Bethlehem." "How far is it to Bethlehem?" asked Elizabeth. "Not very far, my dear," said Ephuriel. After a while they came to a town on the bank of another river. "This is Hamelin," said Ephuriel. "The river is called the Weser, and the year is 1304 after Jesus' birth. A few years ago, a dreadful misfortune occurred in this town. Well, in a way they only had themselves to blame. They had broken a solemn promise, and that's something one should never do." "What happened?" asked Elizabeth. "The town had been plagued by rats for a long time, but then a rat catcher arrived in town. He played on a magic pipe, and the sound of the pipe made all the rats follow him. The piper led the rats to the river, where they all drowned." "Wasn't that a good thing?" "Yes, of course, but the people in the town had promised the man a big reward if he could save them from the plague of rats. When he had rid them of the rats, they refused to pay what they owed him. What did the rat catcher do then? He began to play on his magic pipe again, and all the children in the town were bewitched by the music of the pipe and followed him. They disappeared inside a huge mountain with the piper and were never seen again. Elizabeth realized that maybe the woman in the market at Hanover had thought she was one of the children who had been lured into the mountain by the rat catcher from Hamelin. They were about to hurry on through Europe and even further back into history, when a ship came running towards them along the road and joined the others. Now the flock numbered 5 sheep. Appeared inside a huge mountain with the piper. Now the flock numbered 5 sheep. Joshua struck the ground with his crook. To Bethlehem, to Bethlehem. Joachim found the key to his box and hid the little piece of paper along with all the other pieces. When his mother came in a little later, he was sitting looking at the picture in the Advent calendar. Mama leaned over him. "Well, look at that, a piper." "He's a rat catcher," said Joachim. They wouldn't give him his reward for talking all the rats away from Hamelin, so he took all the children away with him instead. The people in the town had broken a solemn promise, and that's something one should never do. Then his father came in as well. "What's that you're telling us?" he asked. Joachim realized that he had forgotten again and babbled about what he had read on the piece of paper. "I'm just making it up," he said. "It's only something I'm inventing." "No, it isn't, Joachim," said Papa firmly. "You were talking about the Pied Piper of Hamelin. That's an old story from Germany. Who told you about that?" What could he say? He had to hit on something clever. "Engeveld," he said. She was his teacher, or maybe it was someone in the class. He was telling lies, but wasn't he allowed to lie about a Christmas present? Wasn't that the only thing in the whole world that you could lie about as much as you liked? After school, Mama and Joachim went into town to buy an anorak, and Joachim asked to go into the market. There were not as many people in the market as there were in summer. Some stallholders were selling wreaths and candles, others were selling all sorts of Christmas presents. "I wonder how they can bear to stand here in the middle of the winter," shivered Mama. "There's someone over there selling flowers too." "That's because part of the glory of heaven has strayed down to earth," said Joachim. Something was laughing inside him. "What are you talking about?" asked Mama. "He's selling flowers in the middle of the winter because the glory of heaven has strayed down to earth," repeated Joachim. "You see, there's so much glory in heaven that it can easily spill over." Mama shook her head and sighed in despair. She obviously didn't like him to say such strange things. John was standing behind a table with lots of flowers on it. He winked at Joachim and gave a little wave. When they had passed, Joachim turned around. John was pretending to play on an invisible pipe. The 10th of December. A few seconds later, what Elizabeth had thought was a bird took off and flew down in a spiral towards the pilgrims. Joachim woke up and opened the 10th door in the magic Advent calendar. Today there was a picture of an angel at the top of a church tower. Out of the calendar fell a scrap of paper. Folded over and over, Joachim unfolded it and began to read. Imperial. It happened at Paderborn at the end of the 13th century. Into the little town halfway between Hanover and Cologne rushed a frisky flock of sheep, followed by 2 shepherds, a black king, a little girl, and an angel with wings outspread. It was early in the morning before the town was awake. Only a night watchman was out in the streets. He called out sternly to the 2 shepherds who were chasing their flock of sheep through the town. The next moment he caught sight of the angel hovering above the cobblestones. Then he raised his arms to the sunrise and exclaimed, Alleluia, Alleluia. Whereupon he retreated around a corner and left the streets to the godly procession. They stopped in front of a church in the middle of the town. That's St. Bartholomew's Church, said Furiel. It was built in the 11th century and is called after one of Jesus' 12 apostles. It is told of Bartholomew that he journeyed all the way to India to tell the Indians about Jesus. Elizabeth had noticed something strange. She pointed up at the spire on the church tower. There's a white bird sitting up there, she said. Furiel smiled. If only there were, he said. A few seconds later, what Elizabeth had thought was a bird took off and flew down in a spiral towards the pilgrims. She realized that the bird wasn't a bird after all. What had been sitting on the church spire was an angel, but it was not a grown angel. It was no larger than she was herself. The child angel alighted at Elizabeth's feet. Wonderful, he exclaimed. My name is Imperial, and I'm coming with you to Bethlehem. He whirled around a bit, peered up at Caspar and the 2 shepherds, then looked up at Furiel and said, I've been waiting for a quarter of an eternity. Caspar stood thinking. It was obvious he had something on his mind. A quarter of an eternity, he began. That's about 66,289 years, or about 156,498 years, or more exactly 438,811,977 years and 4 seconds, or perhaps even a little more. It's not easy to say how long a quarter of an eternity lasts. First, you have to find out how long a whole eternity lasts. Then you have to divide it by 4. But exactly how long a whole eternity lasts is very difficult to calculate. No matter which number you start with, eternity will last even longer. So one can say that a quarter of an eternity is as long as a whole eternity. Even a thousandth of eternity is really just as long as the whole of the rest of eternity. This is extremely difficult to understand, for calculating whole or half eternities is a matter for heaven alone. The angel Imperial looked offended. But I've been sitting on top of the church tower for hours, he said. Very possibly, but that's not the same as sitting there for a quarter of an eternity, said Caspar. To avoid a quarrel between the wise men and the cherub, and not just a quarter of a quarrel, Joshua struck the cobblestones with his crook and said, to Bethlehem, to Bethlehem. They set off through the town and out along roads and cattle trails. Imperial sprang in front of the 5 sheep. So the pilgrimage was guarded by angels at both ends. They saw many towns and villages, but didn't stop until they came to the old Roman colonial city of Cologne, on the bank of the river Rhine. Imperial had explained that their route through Europe had been planned so that they should be seen by as few people as possible. Angel Time says it's 1272 years after Christ, he said. They've begun building the great cathedral of Cologne, but it won't be finished for hundreds of years. Joshua banged with his crook, to Bethlehem, to Bethlehem. Imperial said, glorious countryside, isn't it? We're going up the Rhine Valley. There are fortresses and castles, steep vineyards and Gothic cathedrals, dandelions and rhubarb. They hurried along the bank of the biggest river Elizabeth had ever seen. The valley became narrower and narrower, and the mountains higher and higher. They ran past small towns and villages. Out on the river floated an occasional barge. As they sped through the beautiful landscape, Elizabeth turned towards Ephriel and asked whether he had met Imperial before. All the angels in heaven have known each other through all eternity, said Ephriel, laughing. Are there an awful lot of you? Yes, a whole host. How can you all know each other then? We've had the whole of eternity to get to know each other, and you see, that's a very long time. Elizabeth had to think hard so as to understand what Ephriel meant. The angel explained a bit more. If you have a party that lasts for 3 hours, you shouldn't invite more than 5 or 6 guests, and then everyone will be able to talk to everyone else. But if the party lasts for 3 whole days, you can easily have 50 or more guests. Elizabeth nodded. She had discussed this with Mamma when it was her birthday. So, she said, the heavenly party has lasted for all eternity, said Ephriel. Do all the angels have different names? Of course, otherwise we couldn't call out to each other. Otherwise we wouldn't have been persons either. And Ephriel began to say all the angels' names, one after the other. The angels in heaven are called Ariel, Burial, Carosiel, Daniel, Ephriel, Fabiel, Gabriel, Hemeribiel, Emmanuel, Joachiel, Chachaduriel, Luxuriel, Michael, Neriel. That's enough, said Elizabeth. How long would it take you to say all the angels' names? I would have to go on for all eternity. That's pretty good going, to remember all the names by heart, said Elizabeth. With all of eternity at your disposal, it's not so difficult. And I think it's very clever to think up so many different names all landing in L, Elizabeth went on. Ephriel nodded. God's imagination is infinite, just as there are infinitely many stars in the sky. No angel is exactly like another, nor are humans either. You can make 1,000 identical machines, but they are so easy to make that even a human can do it. Finally, the angel Ephriel spoke some words that Elizabeth hid in her heart. Every person on earth is a unique work of creation. Joachim sat smiling to himself. It had been such fun to read about all the angels. Suddenly he heard Mamma on the landing. He didn't have time to hide the paper in the secret box, so he slipped it under his pillow. Mamma leaned over the bed to peep in the calendar. An angel, she said, on a church tower. And then something stupid happened. Joachim forgot that he wasn't supposed to talk about what he had read. Perhaps it was because he was trying to remember all those strange angel names. He said, "That's the cherub, Imperial." Mamma stared at him. Imperial? Joachim nodded. He thought it was a nice name for a mischievous angel, so nice that he kept repeating it inside himself. He's sitting on the top of St. Bartholomew's Church. He's been sitting there for a quarter of an eternity, but now he's about to take off and fly in a spiral down to Elizabeth and the others. Mamma didn't answer Joachim. Instead, she called Papa. When he came into the room, she asked Joachim to tell him what the church in the picture was called. St. Bartholomew's Church, he said. Bartholomew went all the way to India and told the Indians about Jesus, but the church is in Germany, in Paderberg or somewhere. Mama and Papa stood staring at each other. I'll look it up in the encyclopedia, said Papa. Then we'll find out. When he came back, he looked like a ghost, or at least as if he had met an angel or two on the landing. He's quite right. The town's called Paderborn, and there really is an old St. Bartholomew's Church there. They were gazing at Joachim just as they had done last year when he ate nearly all the little Christmas cookies the day before Christmas Eve. Papa took the magic advent calendar down from the wall and inspected it on both sides. Then he hung it up again. And how did you hear about Bartholomew, my lad? Asked Papa. Or about Paderborn, for that matter. At school, said Joachim. And you're telling the truth? Either you were allowed to tell lies about Christmas presents or you weren't. Yes, whispered Joachim. Then they all ran out of time, so there was no more talk of Bartholomew Imperial or Paderborn. Neither Mama nor Papa had time to make their sandwiches for lunch. Joachim's most important victory that morning was that he managed to hide the little piece of paper in his secret box before he ran off to school. He hid the key in the bookshelf. When he came home from school, Mama was there. She had opened his secret box. Mama had done something she had promised she would never do. She had broken a solemn promise. She had done something that was as bad as opening other people's letters. On the dining table lay all 10 pieces of paper that Joachim had found in the magic advent calendar. He was furious. He was so angry with Mama that he wanted to hit her. You promised me that the secret box was mine and that you'd never open it, he said. So you tell lies, and you steal too. Then Papa came home. He had talked to Mama on the phone. It was he who had said she should try to find the key and open the secret box. They had to find out how Joachim knew so many strange names and used so many grown-up words. Joachim said they shouldn't have been allowed to have children, for people who tell lies to their children might suddenly begin to hit them as well, he said, and that was against the law. They could at least have waited until he came home from school and asked if they could open his box. Finally, he managed to say that he had hidden the scraps of paper because he wanted to pack them up and give them to Mama and Papa for Christmas. He said that he'd throw away the whole of Magic Advent calendar. Then he began to cry. He rushed into his room and slammed the door behind him as hard as he could. He was never going to forgive them. He would never listen to them anymore either. He would never believe them again. Never. Joachim sat on his bed and tried to look up at the magic advent calendar, but his eyes were so wet that the colors slid into one another, and he could no longer pick out the angels from the shepherds in the fields. Everything was spoiled. The advent calendar had suddenly become ordinary. Like every other advent calendar, it wasn't the least bit magical anymore. After a long time, something began to sing in his ears, and the song he heard was something like Sabbath Tabas, Sabbath Tabas, Sabbath Tabas. It was such a mysterious song that he suddenly realized that perhaps it didn't make any difference whether Mama and Papa knew about the scraps of paper in the advent calendar. Perhaps the magic advent calendar was so full of secrets that there would be enough for the whole family. He had still not said that he had met John. That was something he had to himself. There was a knock at the door. Joachim didn't answer, but after a little while, Papa cautiously opened the door. It's true, we've been silly, he said. Can you forgive us? Asked Mama. Did you read what was on the secret pieces of paper? Asked Joachim. I suppose I did, said Mama. But you see, I don't know which piece came out of the calendar first. Maybe you can show us, and perhaps read it all to Papa? Joachim considered carefully. All right, then. He was a little relieved at what had happened, really. From now on, he had no need to hide anything. Besides, he would be able to ask Mama and Papa if there was something he didn't understand. From now on, the magic advent calendar would belong to the whole family.